Okay, hello. Welcome to this lesson, which is focusing on the narrative choice in paper 1, question 5. Now, it is going to be using a picture, but of course, it's possible that you'll be writing a story without that, with a different kind of prompt, and it still works, whatever the case. So the focus today is to plan a compelling story. Plan and prepare a compelling story. Now that word compelling is important because if you push towards that, you're pushing towards a level 4 response in language. If you push into any kind of level 4 response in language, you're definitely on a grade 8 and you're potentially onto a 9. And I think a lot of us can have the ambition to try and move that high. Okay, so here's the kind of task that we could do. Write a short story suggested by this picture. Yeah, it's probably more likely to say write a short story set in a desert or set in an empty space or something like that, suggested by this picture. But it's still pretty much the same. Now, how is this different from description? Not as different as you might think. Remember, we've talked about this before, that the difference between description and narrative is not as wide as people might suggest. Narratives have a lot of description in them. The key really is focused around these 3 elements. That's certainly how AQA see it. They've identified this as the 3 things that are central to narrative: character, event, and setting. Now, straight away, I'm going to say to you that in every case, you really don't want to have more than one of each of those. One character, one event, and one setting. And the event is what makes it a particular story. Now, okay, it is possible you will use a second character, but if you do, they shouldn't be a main character. They really, I think, need to be a side character. A secondary character, often quite mysterious, only used if you need your main character to interact with someone. And in fact, in most cases, a second character for me is as much a part of the event as a character themselves. They often are the person who creates that change. And in terms of the event, if you have really more than one thing happening, you're going to struggle in what essentially is a 30-minute story. You just don't have time to craft it and have any kind of idea here. And the key, particularly if we're looking for something to be high and compelling, is to think like normal short stories are, or have written, particularly if they're particularly short, that the event is not something dramatic. You can't really earn the opportunity to be dramatic in a short space of time. So it's about something subtle, something small, but something that is going to create change for the character. It's going to mean that the character is going to go from where they were before the event to somebody different after. And that's the key to it. And only one setting is necessary then for any of that. And of course, the entire point of setting in a short story is very similar to the way we've used in description. It is about mood and atmosphere and a reflection of the character. It's certainly not that horrible old cliche of setting the scene. So, if they're the 3 elements to it, what about the structure of it? Well, I think it's quite simple that you begin with an opening that is intended purely to engage the reader. Okay, there's got to be an element of exposition to it. Remember that word, in which you introduce them to the key things that they have to understand, engage with for the story. But as much as anything else, it's about drawing in your reader. That will then build to the event itself. And then there'll need to be an ending, a fallout from the event, if you like. And it's quite possible it'll end with a small little twist. Now, what would this potentially look like? Well, let's use this example. A short story suggested by this picture. Okay? We want to achieve a story that is interesting to an audience, and actually, in this case, really compelling for an audience to read, where ideas flow from one to another effectively, doesn't feel disjointed, where we can use vocabulary and writing techniques to gain an effect, and where the structure is particularly effective. So, here's an example that I could give you, a character. Well, I want a character who's going to be able to drive a story that fits this situation. So I've chosen a young man, okay, nice and easy for me to write about. I once was a young man, believe it or not. A young man who has been recently bereaved. So, as with so many situations, the character has a background that drives the story. Right? Recently bereaved, and he feels like he just wants to leave the world behind. So I'm already a situation which is very clear, got a very clear mood, a very clear setting to begin with. What's going to happen to him? I told you it was subtle. The event is basically, it's going to get dark and he's going to get frightened. Which of course is then going to potentially push us into, as you can probably guess, the idea that he realises there's something more to stay and live for. The setting, of course, is going to be a desert like this. Now, I'm going to focus particularly on the idea of emptiness and probably flatness. And I would do something here that many of you could, and that is to borrow or steal, really, from some of the things that we've read. I think I would take that whole Ozymandias idea of the sands stretching out as far as they can. Yeah, I think I would take that to suggest again the overwhelming power of nature. But I would also use this tree, which I recognise as a Joshua tree, because I'm a U2 fan, and I would use that as a symbol. It is, I'm aware, a tree that is able to flourish in the desert. That could work very, very nicely for the idea of the man himself. I think I'm probably going to end up using it as a symbol for him and maybe for the hope that he could have. So that gives me a sense of how I want to do it. Now, how am I going to organise it? My compelling opening. I'm going to start with the setting. So often that's the case. Establishing the setting allows me to set up mood, allows me to control what I want. Without having to introduce the character, I can go for the idea of a feeling of depth, a feeling of decay, a feeling of that emptiness within him. Okay, and I can use or introduce the Joshua tree and personify it and set up the idea that it kind of feels there's a sense of somebody feeling like a Joshua tree, but not really being one, if you see what I mean, not having that much independence as they think they've got. And then in that opening, I'm going to bring it down, bring the sun down. And as the sun begins to go down, I think I'm going to get more sinister. I'm going to try and use shadows, use strange shapes, use sounds, use sensory ideas to begin to give a sense of something feeling much more dangerous. I'm going to then move on with this getting dark and getting frightened. To get the frightened idea across, this is what I'm going to go. I'm going to go to sound. I'm going to have strange animal noises appearing around. It goes there, and then apparently out of the middle of nowhere, a wild dog is going to appear. I talked about the idea of him getting frightened as it gets dark, and this is what's going to cause this. A wild dog is going to appear right in front of him, potentially snarling or maybe just staring at him like it's some kind of strange demon or whatever, like it's the last thing he's going to see. But to bring it to the ending, I'm going to have the dog just looking at him, then slowly walking off to join its family. And again, he won't have noticed the family before now. He'll notice it as the dog walks off to join them. And that's going to lead him to understand the importance of being with others. And I'll probably do that through memory, maybe even through a very minor kind of flashback. So that's the shape of my story. Not much happens, but you can see how I can concentrate within this on a number of techniques, a number of ideas to control it. I think between establishing the setting and the strange animal noises, I might introduce the character a little bit. I might have the character beginning to feel a little uneasy so that we get a sense of who they are. But apart from that, that is pretty much my plan. And I feel that if I now said to you, go and write this story, I feel most of you could do a fantastic job. So really, it's a case of you doing the same. Different picture, same task. Have a look at it. This character could be that guy in the middle. It's suggested by the picture, so it doesn't have to be. Okay. The event could involve some of the things you see. It may not. The setting may be exactly what you see in front of you, or it may not be. It could be before this happened. It could be going back into the past when that house wasn't collapsing. It could just be inspired, the idea of some kind of decaying place that was once inhabited. You have the idea. You then need to plan out how you're going to open, what the event is going to be, and how that's going to go to ending. Very much like we just did in the example I showed you. Now that's what I want you to prepare and bring along next week, and we're going to use a few starters in next week's lessons to, or certainly one of next week's lessons, just to have a little think about how that might work and some of the techniques we might use in putting that together.